What's up, everybody? I'm going to geek out on some technology that doesn't seem like it should work here for a second. Here you got some chains that dangle down on a rotor, and instead of attaching snow chains directly to the tire, this thing spins around and you just keep running over separate links of chain. I think it'd probably mess up during heavy braking when the analog kicks in, but hopefully they worked all that out. The next one here is pretty freaking awesome, but it really doesn't seem like it should work. This is the Fulton Skyhook, and if you need to extract personnel quickly and covertly, this will do the trick. It can be dropped out in a package right there, and inside is a harness, 500 feet of rope, a helium bottle, and a balloon. So you inflate the balloon with the rope on it, and a plane with a specialized nose catch comes along and snags the rope, cuts the balloon loose, and the physics on this somehow lifts you up gradually, and then as the slack is taken up, you gradually speed up to the speed of the plane. And that looks like one heck of a ride. So the fact that this works, and the fact that none of us have ever heard of this, I mean, this is some real-life Marvel Comics action scene, you know? Actually, I think James Bond did it in a movie, but action producers would love something like this, and the fact that it really works in real life makes it that much more authentic, but they don't ever show this. So I'm thinking this actually gets used quite a bit in operations, they just don't want attention drawn to it. I know the first official use of this was the Soviets had built a base on an iceberg, so they dropped a couple guys down to snoop around for a couple days, and then to pick them up, they flew over and snagged them with this. But I'm thinking this gets used all the time. They just don't want to say anything about it. Speaking of thou shalt not say anything, I think pretty much everybody saw the Galen Windsor video. This guy used to design and build nuclear power plants. And after years and years of working with these radioactive materials, the financiers came along and said, well, no, that's dangerous, so you can't do that anymore. So he tried to explain this new technology to the public.
Not very radioactive. Just take the cap off. Oh my goodness. Very radioactive. This instrument will only count gamma, energy. It's just energy. Light's coming from those lights. Only you're getting lots of infrared from the lights as well as ultraviolet. Energy response, and it's very carefully damped to only discriminated so it only gets the energy that comes from this. I don't want it to respond to a light, just to this. It cost me $1,000 to get an instrument that'll just respond to this and not to that.
So he used to go on speaking tours with a rock bearing raw uranium in it and a little film canister of plutonium. He would actually eat this stuff on stage and explain that there's no part of the body that can actually absorb the material itself. According to him, anything shy of critical mass is relatively harmless. He said they used to grab one rock, put it in their left pocket, another rock, put it in their right pocket, and as long as the two never came together, then they were fine. So let me explain all this to the best of my understanding. These radioactive materials are constantly shedding neutrons as part of the radioactive decay. For the it's all fake crowd, you can look up cloud chambers, and you can actually see this shooting the neutrons off. And this is emitting gamma radiation. The sun is also emitting gamma rays. And what it sounds like to me is at low levels, it's relatively harmless. Yeah, you can pick it up with a little meter that goes tick, tick, tick. But according to Galen and all of the information I'm about to present with Chernobyl, 3 Mile, nothing happened at 3 Mile Island, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Fukushima, you would think the whole island of Japan would be glowing right now. And that we'd have a whole generation of toxic Avenger mutants. But you might be surprised about the birth defect rates and cancer rates and all of these things that are supposed to happen if you're exposed to this. Now, I'm not saying this stuff is completely harmless. We'll talk about the radium girls in another video, but just like sunlight, a little bit of sunlight is fine. A lot of it's going to hurt you. And it seems to be the same way with the ionizing radiation. The other ways it's harmful is once you reach critical mass, then it's releasing massive amounts of heat and it can cook you from the inside out. But in low doses, it seems to be rather benign, and radium was actually touted as a wonder drug when it was first developed. So it's actually possible that, like sunshine, a little bit of it's good for you, where a lot of it not so much. But outside of the radium girls, there's not a lot of evidence that it's actually harmful, and they may have been a psyop in the first place. So this kind of tells you everything you need to know about this, but you guys stick around and watch the rest of the video. The first atomic power plant went into use in 1957. There were no major problems for 22 years up until 1979. Then on March 16th, 1979, they released the movie The China Syndrome, which was a thriller about a nuclear power plant melting down. All kinds of big stars: Jack London, Wilford Brimley, Jane Fonda, Michael Douglas. And I want to point this out. Jane Fonda was a huge comrade. And Michael Douglas is son of Isser Danilyevich Dembski. So all I'm going to say is people with motives made this movie. Released March 16th, 1979, 22 years after we had been using atomic energy just fine. No real problems. And then 12 days later, on March 28th, we had the 3 Mile Island accident. 22 years with no problems, and then 12 days after they make a panic flick, 3 Mile Island occurs. Yeah. And we all know how that turned out, right? Yeah, with no fatalities or injuries. And they say while there was a release of radioactive materials, studies indicate it had no detectable health effects on the surrounding community. Now, this is one of those tricky spots where normally I'd say, okay, you guys are covering this up. But are they? Well, let's look at Chernobyl, which was way worse, which will likely remain uninhabitable for at least 20,000 years. That's super duper dangerous. But, Reactor 4 melted down in 1986, made worldwide headline news. And then in 2006, they started design work for the containment dome. Construction started in 2010. The massive steel structure was moved into position in 2016. And you would think, well, okay, it was so hot they couldn't get in there to work on it for 20 years. But that was Reactor 4. Reactors 1 through 3 kept running until 1996 and 1991, and Reactor 3 ran till 2000. So they were still manning these stations for 14 years after Reactor 4 blew. They were still producing electricity, full crews. Now with this, they had to send 2 guys in on a you're not coming back mission, and they got pretty well fried. They say altogether, I think 31 people perished. And we'll talk about acute radiation sickness here in a minute, but this is what they say about the long-term effects of this. An oncologist's perspective at 35 years. They start off with the risk of developing a radiation-induced cancer is dose-related. The higher the dose, the greater the probability a cancer in an A-bomb survivor was caused by radiation exposure. Second, the A-bomb data allow us to determine the briefest interval from radiation exposure to cancer diagnosis. Oh yeah, here's what's going on here is they had tested an A-bomb there before they built the power plant. So that place has had all kinds of radioactivity in the past. Looking at specific cancer types, we know about 1/3 of the 312 leukemias developing in these 94,000 survivors were caused by or contributed to by their A-bomb radiation exposure. Now, just so you know, 312 out of 94,000 people is 0.003, which is less than 1% of people that develop leukemia. Consequently, we and others looked carefully for an increase in leukemias in the 10 years after the accident, but found no convincing evidence of one. However, one group reported a modest increase in CLL, which is chronic leukemia, among persons assigned to mitigate the accident, the liquidators, who received much higher radiation doses than the general population. The liquidators were the guys that they threw a rubber mat on and gave a mask and some goggles, and they went out and cleaned up all the debris. I know they moved a bunch of dirt off. I don't know why. But one group reported a modest increase in CLL out of the people with the most exposure right at ground zero. Another report says the bottom line is there are few data to suggest that radiation release from Chernobyl increased cancer globally. Admittedly, failing to detect an increase does not prove that there was no increase. However, any increase must be relatively small. We should recall that about 40% of us will develop cancer in our lifetimes. Even if there were an increase from Chernobyl-related radiation, it would be less than 0.1% using current risk models. I should also mention there are also no convincing data that birth defects or genetic abnormalities were increased by radiation released from Chernobyl, despite what you might read elsewhere. This is confirmed by a recent National Institute of Health report. Another report says there's no conclusive evidence that radiation exposure from Chernobyl caused a widespread increase in birth defects or genetic changes passed on to children. A report on where the fallout fell says these results indicated that the low dosage of radiation did not have a detectable biological effect in terms of birth defects and abortions. And speaking of fallout, they've tested thousands, like 2,000 open air BOMBs. In America alone, they did about 1,000 in Nevada. So all of that fallout flies all across everything east of there, which is 80% of the people in America. But now they act like if Rasputinnikov set off a little tactical, then that's it. It's the end of the world. We're going to have nuclear winters and it's the end of humanity. In another test in 1957, I believe, they had 5 soldiers stand at ground zero directly below the blast. And they did this to show the local townspeople around there that it was perfectly safe for them to be doing this testing. So a couple jets fly in, they shoot off an atomic warhead that detonates at 18,500 feet directly above them. And this was a 2 kiloton blast. So that's about 3.5 miles. That's it. Just 3.5 miles directly above their heads, and they were perfectly fine. And nobody was worrying about them getting a tiny little speck of dust on them that'll make a Geiger counter go click, click, click. But then all of a sudden in the 70s, these headlines became terrifying. Have you guys seen any of the documentaries about the wildlife there? It's literally the best nature preserve on the face of the earth. No humans go in there hardly, except for a few soldiers every once in a while. Well, now they let tourists in, but the wildlife is thriving there, including, well, they're wild now, but formerly domesticated breeds of cats and dogs. They have one of the largest wolf packs in the world there. So nobody told the wildlife that this place was uninhabitable for 20,000 years, and they are thriving better than anywhere else, one of the most natural ecosystems we have. But if you take a little Geiger counter, then it'll go tick, tick, tick. But if you stay there too long, then you look like this. Sorry, that's actually another problem altogether. Aside from the other crazy features here, have you ever seen a back of a head that square? This is what happens when you drink too many babies and inbreed for 10 generations. Now, I did find this claiming to be an authentic picture of radiation poisoning, but I don't know. They also say that there's headless mutant moose out there, too. So this is a definite no, and this one is a probably no. I really haven't found anything definitively saying that there's negative long-term effects with this, but acute radiation sickness, I watched a whole video on this, and initially, you have gastrointestinal problems that I never heard an explanation of why that happens, but nausea and vomiting. And this also damages your bone marrow. So you stop producing proper blood cells. But after the initial gastrointestinal problems, they call it the latent period where nothing happens. And it could be weeks with really nothing. You just kind of go back to normal. Now, if your bone marrow was damaged enough, then you're not producing white blood cells, and it's a lot like AIDS. Your body just can't fight anything off. And that's how people actually perish long term from this. But where they say a second main phase of the illness, that's what they're talking about, is you get an infection or something and your body can't fight it off. Then I love how they say 4, either recovery or death. Yeah, kind of like if you get a cold, you either recover or perish. I think they're intentionally making things sound scary here. Most cases, it seems like everybody got better. I actually asked here, how many people have perished from acute radiation sickness overall, and all they can bring up is 164 from Chernobyl. But then even with that, They say 28 people perished shortly after, which is around what I've heard. I think 31 was another number I heard, with another 134 having been treated. So that's where they're getting their 164 from. So what it sounds like to me is you have to be around enough of this stuff for it to just cook you from the inside out like a microwave. But here they are making the rods that fuel the reactor, and you got a guy with some latex gloves on, and these guys are doing this all day. Today, everybody makes fun of these kids' toys that were made back in the 1950s that had actual uranium in there. And everybody's all, oh my God, I can't believe they actually did that. Well, it turns out it's fine. It wasn't hurting anything then, and it wouldn't be hurting anything now. Another one that always makes me laugh when people bring it up is Operation Paperclip. Oh, I can't believe they brought all these Germansies over. And that's what I thought at first when I heard that. But what, do you think after a war, they arrest every engineer, every factory worker, and everyone associated with a political party? It's not a war crime to serve and defend your country or to produce the armaments that it needs. But since it's the Germansies, everybody just assumes that they should be in jail. I mean, do you think we went and arrested every scientist, engineer, and soldier that fought for Saddam Hussein in Iraq? No, they were just following their orders. Anyway, in low doses, it seems like this radioactive stuff is relatively harmless, but the one case that had good evidence for it actually harming people is the radium girls. We'll talk about that in another video. They were like painting glow-in-the-dark watch dials, and they were constantly licking the paintbrush. They'd go out to the club with glow-in-the-dark makeup on, seriously, and apparently this kind of rotted out all their bones. So I guess there is a threshold to where it becomes harmful, but conversely, they were touting radium as a wonder drug when it first came out, with all kinds of positive benefits. So I'll make a video about that sometime. But all of this crap about solar and clean energy, it's very frustrating because we all know it's just another control mechanism that they're utilizing. It's the invisible enemy, which is how they demonized this. But it sounds like we could have one of these on the edge of every town and everybody have a $5 a month electric bill. The new AI plants are going to need tons and tons of power, and so they're just going to build on-site reactors. It's good enough for AI, but we can't utilize it to help us. So the bottom line is it's these mutants that you should watch out for. Man, then knows. Dude's definitely got the word gold in his name. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.